On May 14th, 2022, 10 innocent people fell victim to an 18-year-old shooter named Peyton Gendron. He stormed into the Tops Friendly Market supermarket in Buffalo and opened fire. His targets were African Americans. His motives, as police later discovered, were laid out in a 180-page manifesto. The most frequently used term in that document was the Great Replacement. According to the Young Radical, elites are deliberately replacing the white population by bringing immigrants of other ethnicities into Western countries. And the only way to stop this creeping conquest is to take up arms. Gendron was wrong, but only halfway. Ethnic replacement is a real phenomenon, but the reason is not some conspiracy of evil elites. If you were hoping for a conspiracy theory, wrong channel. The reason is merciless mathematics. Everything revolves around the magical number 2.1, also known as the birth replacement rate. 2.1 children per woman is the fertility level required for a population to reproduce itself. And now, all eyes on the map. Countries marked in red are above that level. Green-marked countries are below. So chances are, while you are watching this video, the population of your country is slowly melting away. Now, is this bad? Is ethnic replacement a problem? Well, that is a question of abstract ethics, which is not exactly our wheelhouse. What is obvious, however, is that for many people it is a problem. So let us simply assume you are one of them. In that case, is there a solution? Here we have two pieces of news, one bad and one good. The bad news is that humanity has already tried 3 different approaches, and all 3 failed miserably. The good news is that here at How the World Works channel, we may have stumbled upon a 4th approach. It sounds insane, but it just might work. As always, let us start from the very beginning and break the logic down step by step. First, let's get rid of obvious nonsense. Economic stability and accessible health care have the opposite effect. The next time someone argues that higher birth rates require investment in public health care, financial support for families, and a prosperous economic environment, simply slap them across the face, figuratively speaking, of course, with the following data. One of the fastest growing countries in the world today is South Sudan. Urban population, 21%. GDP per capita, $637 a year, and yet its population grows by 4.5% annually. Not far behind is Niger, with an urban population of 17%, GDP of $735, and a growth rate of only 3.5%. Meanwhile, the United States, with its staggering GDP per capita of $84,000, is barely growing. And don't get me started on Germany, with $56,000 per person annually, and population decline of 0.12%. So, poor countries reproduce, rich countries do not. Why? We have already named one factor, urbanization. Allow me to explain with a personal example. The author of this video spent last summer with his family in a house in southern Serbia. It is one of the most picturesque places in the Balkans. To put it briefly, imagine Switzerland, only much cheaper. You wake up to the sound of bells because a shepherd is driving a flock of sheep past the house. You drink coffee overlooking breathtaking mountains. You have a spacious home that could easily be expanded with a few extra rooms if you wished. Around it lies a yard covered in soft grass. And you think to yourself, yes, I would not mind if a couple of children were running around. On the last day of the vacation, I drove my family to the airport. We passed a newly built residential district. In the middle of a huge muddy field rose rows of faceless concrete boxes. At the center sat a miserable playground with a pathetic slide and a tree already beginning to wither. No greenery around. Gusts of sandy wind swept through the empty streets. Call me crazy, but I don't want to raise children in such environment. And I'm not the only person who thinks this way, am I? And it is not just about comfort. It is about the profitability of a single baby unit. Fair warning, today's video will be as cynical as possible. In the countryside, a child becomes useful at the age of 5. You hand him a stick and send him to herd the geese. In the city, a 5-year-old child becomes a major expense. Language classes, tutoring, preparation for admission into a good school. A 17-year-old teenager in the countryside helps gather grass for the cow before winter. A 17-year-old urban teenager goes off to college, where he deals with a very different kind of grass. In other words, for a rural resident, a child represents a net economic gain. For an urban resident, a child represents a net economic loss. And that is without even considering opportunity costs. I do not have a Netflix subscription, so I will use an example from my youth, back when television was free. Sex and the City, Miranda, a successful lawyer. When she has a child and effectively drops out of the labor market for several years, can you imagine the scale of the losses she incurs? While for a rural woman, this is not really a factor. Milking cows and beheading chickens is not much of a career anyway. But since we're already discussing the joys of motherhood in the cold and calculating terms of economics, why not use that same framework for good? The first approach to solving demographic decline is built precisely on this idea. Women need to be bribed, given economic incentives to have more children. 3 classic examples: Hungary, Norway, and Russia. What came of their efforts, you will find out in just a moment. But first, I would like to solicit a bribe from you. All I need is your subscription to the channel. Seriously, it costs you nothing, while for me, it is a massive incentive to keep making good content. Thank you in advance. Alright, now that you have scratched my back, I am ready to scratch yours. So then, 3 case studies. Hungary. In 2010, Prime Minister Viktor Orban launched one of the most aggressive family support packages in Europe. The package included family tax breaks, subsidized housing loans, income tax exemptions for mothers with 4 children, and a massive ideological campaign that essentially boiled down to have children to save the nation. And it's not like it didn't work at all. The TFR, which stands for total fertility rate, rose from 1.23 to 1.59, but that is still nowhere near the numbers required. To return to replacement level, fertility would have needed to almost double. The second case is Russia, which in 2007 launched the Maternity Capital Program. The approach there was different. We must literally shower future mothers with cash. So the program offered a large one-time payment for the birth of a second child. The sums involved were substantial, enough, for example, to cover a down payment on a home. And yet, the results were just as modest as in Hungary. The increase in TFR was roughly 0.15. Moreover, many experts believe that the program merely accelerated the birth of a second child that families had already planned. So far, we cannot find an example of a successful money goes in babies come out program.
I know!
You are already raising your hand.
What about Norway?
Yes, Norway and Sweden are always cited as the success stories. Both countries invested heavily and systematically in social support programs, free daycare, long paid parental leave, and especially paid paternity leave that could not simply be transferred to the mother. The idea was to distribute childcare responsibilities more evenly between parents. At first, the results looked impressive. In both Norway and Sweden, TFR in the 2000s climbed to nearly 2. Replacement level was already visible on the horizon, but after the 2000s, the numbers began to decline again. Sweden fell back below a TFR of 1.5. It seems that as people's standard of living rises, so do their expectations. Benefits that 20 years ago encouraged families to have a second child gradually begin to feel like the bare minimum. And if the state wants to keep successfully bribing families into having children, it must constantly increase the proverbial bribe, which just stops making economic sense at some point. All right, if this problem obviously cannot be solved with a carrot, it is time for a stick approach. And who could possibly be better for that than a seasoned communist dictator? Before you stands Nicolae Ceausescu, the longtime leader of Romania's Communist Party. By the end of his rule, the sale of light bulbs in Romanian stores had been limited to 1 per customer. So yes, communism certainly works. His demographic policies proved no less successful. Ceausescu was delivering babies with an iron fist, pun intended. In 1967, the infamous Decree 770 was introduced. Abortions were banned, contraception was banned. Childless adults were subjected to a special tax. And at first, the results were absolutely staggering. TFR rose from 1.9 in 1965 to 3.7 in 1968. At this rate, Romanians would become the largest nation in Europe within a few generations. Spoiler, it didn't happen. people gradually adapted to the new reality. They became more careful in bed. Grandmother's homemade contraceptive methods, which I do not even remotely wish to describe here, were in use again. Soon the results began a slow but steady decline. By the 1980s, TFR had already fallen back to a modest 2, and after the collapse of the regime in 1989, it plunged further down to 1.3. The moral of the story: just as it is apparently impossible to encourage women to have more babies, it is equally impossible to force them, if you wish to preserve anything remotely resembling human rights, that is. But what about a middle path? Neither bribery nor coercion, but persuasion, ideological conditioning. And who could handle that better than religion? But can religious motivation actually overpower economic reality? Fortunately, this clash has already taken places on 2 different rings. The first is called Iran. At the beginning of the 20th century, enormous oil reserves were discovered there. Investment poured into the country. Iran underwent accelerated modernization. The population moved into cities. Female education expanded rapidly. At the same time, following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the country effectively transformed into a theocracy, governed by Sharia law and saturated with religious propaganda. How did this affect fertility? You are unlikely to find more illustrative numbers anywhere else. In the mid-20th century, Iran's TFR was typical for a traditional agrarian society, around 7 children per woman. Yet by the year 2000, it had collapsed to 1.6. Modernization, 1. Religion, 0. Incidentally, Saudi Arabia shows a very similar pattern. In the 1960s, TFR, there was also around 7 children per woman. Today, it is roughly 2.3. That is still above replacement level. Hooray to Saudi Arabia. But the trend is unmistakable. And what about Christian countries? Here, the battle, less spectacular perhaps, but no less revealing, took place in Poland. To this day, it remains one of Europe's most Catholic countries, with a strong religious identity. The country has extensive abortion restrictions and numerous support programs for young families. The result? A pitiful 1.14 births per woman. These case studies speak for themselves. Believing in God while living in a 1-bedroom apartment is still possible. Following divine instructions on reproduction under those conditions? Well, not so much. Now, all 3 strategies have failed. Bribe them, force them, persuade them, none of it worked. Do you have any other ideas of how to improve demography? Well, this guy certainly did. In case you did not recognize him, this is Leo Tolstoy, the great Russian writer. You may know him from such bestsellers as War and Peace and Anna Karenina, which, by the way, is one of the most boring books in human history. Seriously. I put on the audiobook whenever I cannot fall asleep. Works every single time. However, Tolstoy also wrote a somewhat lesser-known novella called The Kreutzer Sonata. In it, the protagonist murders his wife because family life has become unbearable to him. And what makes it unbearable, in his view, is precisely modern civilization. For example, his wife worries too much about the children's health, which she shouldn't. A quote,
"If she had truly been a human being, she would have had faith in God, and she would have spoken and thought the way simple peasant women do. God gave, God took away. You cannot escape God."
In other words, Tolstoy believed we must reorder our priorities. Comfort, pleasure, even human life itself should become secondary, while reproduction, as a purpose, as something demanded of us by God or nature, must take first place. And you know what? There are people who literally followed this advice, and it worked. I am talking about radical religious movements that form closed communities. The first example that comes to mind is the Amish in the United States and Canada. The second is the Haredim, ultra-Orthodox Jews. Large populations exist both in Israel and in the United States, especially in places like New York and New Jersey. Both with the Amish and the Haredim, the demographic picture is very clear. The former boast of a TFR of around 6, while the latter are effectively world champions, with an astonishing 6.6 births per woman. And these people do exactly what Tolstoy recommended. They reject modern comfort. The Amish are straightforward about it. They simply refuse many technological advances. 1 horsepower is enough. The Haredim are even more interesting. They are integrated into urban life. But when you have 6 children in the family, your apartment does not magically acquire 6 extra rooms. Moreover, in such households, usually only the man works. As a result, income per family member in Haredi households is on average 47% lower than the Israeli national average. The same pattern holds for living space per person, and yet they continue having children. And now for the most cynical part of the video. If I were the government, I would use groups like these as literal human breeding farms. I would shower them with every possible privilege and exemption, encourage them to have even more children. The logic is simple. No community, not even the most isolated one, can retain 100% of the younger generation. The temptations of the outside world are simply too strong. Out of 6 children born into an Amish family, 2 will inevitably leave the village and head off to conquer New York, thus keeping demographic averages up. And let us be honest, we are already implementing this exact policy today, only on a global scale. Countries with high birth rates, poor countries, mostly located on the African continent, already function as population donors for the rest of the world. We are literally breeding people there and then importing them into Western countries as needed. So why not make the process more localized and controlled? If this idea makes sense to you, and if you are not yet an Amish and therefore still able to use modern technology, give it a like. And if you want to learn about a man who went one step further and seriously proposed relocating the entire population of a massive country into villages, and whose ideas are taken seriously by the government of that massive country, watch our video about the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin. It is right here.